During this half hour, we shift into a track that we've called Practical Apologetics. And in this hour, each day this week, we're going to be talking about things that I think are very practical in their nature in terms of how do we help others? How do we work through certain kinds of difficulties? And it is my honor this morning to introduce Brother Rick Billingsley, who's going to talk to us about how we can reach the skeptic with faith. Rick and his wife Deborah have 3 children and 10 grandchildren. His educational background, he attended several undergraduate colleges, but got a BA in counseling from Chicago Theological Seminary and an MA in theological studies from the same institution. He has been preaching since 1977 in a number of states, Florida, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Tennessee. He is currently preaching for the Holly Springs Church in Holly Springs, North Carolina. In addition to that, he has done foreign work in Belize, Newfoundland, the Philippines, and South Korea. Brother Billingsley has written a number of books that are published by Truth Publications. In the Bible textbook series, he has written the book on James. He also has done a book on world religions, and both of those books are in the foyer. You can take a look at those. He also wrote the commentary on Zechariah in the Minor Prophets in the Truth Commentary series. His most recent book came out in 2020 entitled In His Image. Unfortunately, those sold so well, we're out of stock of those, or we would have had some of those in the foyer as well. We're delighted to introduce Brother Rick Billingsley to talk to us about reaching the skeptic for Christ.
Thank you, Kyle. Can you guys hear me okay with this? Oh, great. So I stand behind the podium. When I found out about the lectureship series and Kyle talked to me about participating, I thought this is going to be a piece of cake. I just did a whole series on why I believe in God. And I did the historical Christ, and I talked about validity of the Bible and all this. I thought, wow, I can preach one of those lessons. But when he gave me the title, I said, I don't have a lesson in that title. He just burst my bubble. You know? So I thought, okay, how am I going to be able to approach this? And I decided just approach it by my own personal experiences and how to talk to people, set up Bible studies with different kinds of religions. I work from Buddhists to Hindus to you name it, different ones, Scientology. That's why I wrote the book on world religions, because a lot of that is based upon our personal experience working with these people. Well, I have a clicker. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay. And there is no one who does good. You know, first thing I learned about this passage is that when we leave God out of the picture, when we don't believe in God, and we don't serve our God, then man becomes corrupt. Paul said because they did not retain the knowledge of God, that they actually turned to their own desires, and God said, I gave them over to a reprobate mind. And they did those things that were indecent, that were not godly. So I really believe our responsibility when I look at this passage is that we have to teach others about God and his nature and who God really is. And so I believe it's my responsibility when I teach people to bring them to the Lord, to explain about who God is and all about his nature to mankind, the relationship with mankind. This was actually on the headlines and on the news at Fox News. My brother actually saw it, and he sent it over to me. And the title is, American Churches Closes Faster Than New Ones Can Open. This is actually about a Church of Christ building. They closed the doors in Manchester, Tennessee. And they interviewed, the pastor, the preacher. And they said, what happened? How come you had to close your doors? He said, I couldn't even get my own members to come out on Sunday night or Wednesday night and for Bible study, and they just show no interest. And he said, I worked in this community for almost 18 years. He said, nobody really cares about learning about God. I don't really totally agree with that. We We've been in existence for about 1.5 years now. We've had 6 baptisms, and we converted 2 families from the community. In turn, I just opened up another Bible study on the way here. I was on the phone talking to them. They have another person they want me to talk to and study with. So I really don't agree with that. Years ago, A.C. Gardner held this meeting when I was in Ohio, and we had a luncheon, and there's a bunch of us together. Mike Spike would remember this, because I think Mike and Will and Warnock was there. But anyway, I was just bringing out some of the things that we were doing at that time when I was in Ohio, Inglewood, Ohio. And one of the guys across from me started snickering. He said, man, you can't hardly find people today that will listen to the gospel. He said, I told him, I said, with that kind of attitude, I can see why we're not converting people to our Lord. So I'm a firm believer. There's people out here. We have a little saying where I'm at. We're looking for people who are looking for Jesus. And that's exactly what we have to do. Whoops, I'm getting stuck up here. That's one way to keep me settled down in one area. I was studying with an atheist. And actually, he was a boss of mine at one time when I was in the secular world. And he brought this up to me, and I thought, wow, that's a pretty good question. He asked me, Rick, why aren't you an Islamic? Why don't you believe in Islam? I said, well, I gave him a couple reasons. He said, no. He said, really, you and I have a lot in common. He said, you're an atheist. You just don't know you're an atheist, but you are an atheist. He said, can you prove to me for 100% fact that Allah is not God? Can you prove without a shadow of doubt that the angel Gabriel did not come to Muhammad? I started thinking, well, no. He said, you see, that's what I am. He said, I don't believe in any religion. And the way you feel about Islam is the way I feel about all religions. And it really helped me a lot. It helped me to understand a little bit where they're coming from. Because I'll tell you frankly, I will never become an Islamic. I would never worry about putting my head on a pillow at night and being converted to Islam. And I guess we do have some things in common when it comes to our belief in Islam. Religion skepticism should not be confused with what I call right-out atheism, or perhaps irreligious people. On the contrary, what we find is it may be somebody who just has some serious doubts whether God exists, or serious doubts about the Bible, or perhaps as non-committal to God. I believe what is called, actually, I brought this to Kyle's attention, about skeptics, religious skepticism. These are people that have some form of religion, Mormonism, Islam, Buddhist, Hindu, but they're skeptical about the nature of Jesus or the nature of the Bible. So how do you approach these people? How do we approach the atheist, agnostic? By the way, the previous lectures, you mentioned about Bart Ehrman. I had the pleasure of several conversations with Bart Ehrman when I was at Cary. He had a couple of his students come to my classes, and we had to discuss some of the things that he wrote in some of his books. And they were very good conversations, I could tell you that. Skeptics can be just religious in nature, but they have questions about the nature of God. I want to bring up a couple more things really quick. What is religion? Well, we say it's an ideology. It's something that we believe, but yet we live. And in fact, when I had a debate with the Islamics. I'll talk more about the Islam. These two guys are Islamic, and we had a public discussion. But the first thing he said, if you believe in God, he said, I believe in a God. So what's the difference? Well, there's a lot of difference, right? We know that. Some say it is a form of belief in God. Well, you know what? The Buddhists don't believe in a personal God. So you're not going to be able to approach anyone that way as a Buddhist and say, oh, you just have to believe in God. Well, no, they don't believe in a personal God. Or what we find here, some may say it's a supernatural belief. But a Hindu don't believe in supernatural. They believe in here and now. So when we approach people about religion, I think we have to do it more in a practical way to be able to get them to really think about their life and also about who God is. When you think about Islam, they believe that Jesus is a prophet, right? And that he's just as good as a prophet as anyone else, like such as Muhammad. Judaism, well, they believe in Jesus that he was a good moral teacher, but they don't believe that he was the Son of God, and they don't even believe he was a prophet. Just simply a good moral teacher. You know, when I've dealt with a lot of different religions, I realize something about religions. They all have something in which some spiritual part, but when they don't accept the nature of Christ and the complete nature of the Bible being inspired by God, then they're missing quite a bit. And it's your job and my job to fill in the holes, to be able to give them the knowledge they need about the nature of Christ and the Bible. So what are some of the practical ways to, oh, okay, it's not working? I asked Dan King, I said, Dan, can I get a lapel mic? He said, I don't know. I said, well, I'll go and ask. I said, you get what you asked for.
We tried it. We'll try this.
Okay. Is it on? No? Okay, thanks. So when it comes to evangelizing, what are some of the ways that we can? Well, you know, if you go back and study about ancient Greek culture, you find that they have some messages, and what they have is three components to every message. They have logos, that's the words that we use. You know, words are vehicles of thought. And we find that if I want to translate my thoughts to you, I'm going to use words to do it, right? And we find God said essentially the same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 10 through what? 13? And he said we have spiritual thoughts with spiritual words. And what you and I have to realize, this is the mind of God. And God has revealed his mind by giving us written words. So we use words. And the Greek said, yes, you have to use logos, words. There's pathos. Pathos means how you feel. In fact, when we look at ethos, it's how we live. When I give a sermon, and when I give some kind of talk like we're doing right now in this lectureship series, I use a lot of logos and even some pathos, but I don't use ethos unless I'm trying to convince a skeptic or teach one about God. Then ethos becomes one of the huge components of my message. It's a huge component of the Bible, of the message of the gospel. Here's what he says. Therefore, all that they have tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. I like the old King James. Don't do as they do, but do as they say, because they say and they do not. Let me tell you, we have to live by what we preach, or you're never going to convince anyone about the gospel. I love this passage because it's a personal with me. In the same way, your wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, that they may be won without the word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Did you guys catch that? If they're not won by the word, what is the word? It's God's saving power. It's what he uses to motivate and bring faith into our hearts, right? Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God unto salvation. It has the ability to infuse into our minds and our hearts to motivate us to serve the Lord. Now, Peter said, if they're not won by God's power, maybe by your behavior. You see how powerful ethos is as a message? My dad, I baptized him about 5 years before he died. He was not a Christian for almost his life. It was actually Christmas morning, about 1 o'clock. We're up in the Chicago area. Snow's on the ground. Snow's coming down. And my dad turned to me and said, Rick, I'm ready to be baptized. Now, we assembled at Crestwood, which is about 45-minute drive from our house. I said, Dad, why now? I'm just curious. said, I realized something about your mom's faith. She took 7 kids to services all the time. Sunday morning, Bible study, worship, Sunday night, Wednesday night, by herself. And she would never miss a time. He said, I realized there had to be something to her faith to be that dedicated to raise 7 kids. You know how hard, I love when I baptized my dad, but you know, it was really difficult because when my dad became a Christian, that guy just did a 360. He just changed his whole attitude. He used to make my mom, he wouldn't let my mom give to the treasury, to the Lord's giving. She would have to sneak it out of the money from paying bills and also buying, you know, food or whatever. Man, that guy just turned around and became one of the best givers you ever have. I saw my dad wait on the Lord's table. I never saw that as a kid. But I'm going back to the idea that it was my mom's faith, not so much just her faith, it was her example that motivated my dad to become a child of God. That's powerful stuff. And the Lord said, I use that to convict others to obey me. Go to Acts chapter 16. We're all familiar with this, but I want you to take note. When did the man actually come falling down at the feet of the Apostle Paul? It wasn't when he saw the miracle. They said, go to Acts chapter 16, verse 25. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praising God. And the prisoners were listening to them, and suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison house were shaken. And immediately all the doors were open and everyone's chains were unfastened. Now that's a miracle, right? And when the jailer awoke and saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, do not harm yourself, for we're all here. And he called for the lights and rushed in, and trembling he fell before the feet of Paul and Silas. And after he brought them out, he said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? Paul's love for this guy is what convicted him. Sirs, what must I do to be saved? I don't know about you, but I kind of visualize Paul in my mind, and he's probably, they're usually cells in the floor. I just see him hop back in the cell, shut the door. Please don't kill yourself. We're here. We're all here. We're not going to go anywhere. That's a lot of love. He loved this guy. And I think that's what convicted him. Hey, I'd like to know more about this religion, this guy called Jesus that you serve. You see the difference? I love this. Theodore Roosevelt said, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. First thing we have to realize, if we're going to convict a skeptic, in what area we're talking about, you can't have a blind faith. You can't just simply say, I have faith in God, or I have faith in the Bible. You know, God doesn't want us to have a blind faith. And unfortunately, this is where Christians, we need to be careful, because if you study with Islam, or you're studying with a Buddhist, or you're studying with a Hindu, or if you're just studying with an atheist, you just can't stand up there and say, by the way, I just have faith in God. Well, you know, that's sad. Why do you believe in God? Well, because you just sometimes have to have faith. Now, don't get me wrong. Faith is very important. But God doesn't want us to have that blind faith. The Mormons can say the same thing. Have you ever read in front of the Book of Mormon what they say? Well, you got to pray and ask God whether Joseph Smith was true or not as a prophet. Or you got to ask God whether the Book of Mormon is true. The Islamists say the same thing. They have to have faith in Allah and the Quran, right? So when it comes to it, God doesn't want us to have a blind faith. He wants us to be convicted. He said, these things are written. John chapter 20, verse 21. These things are written that you may know that he is the Son of God. We have to be sure. You know, the Bible reveals people, places, and things. That's for our benefit. When the Bible talks about Nebuchadnezzar, I can go back in history and say, oh, that guy was real in history. These things are given to us by God so that we can go out and prove our faith in the Bible and God's will. The Bible has never been disproven scientifically, historically, geographically. We can use that to show, hey, you know, have you ever thought about how accurate the Bible really is when it comes to science? I used this a couple of times in talking to Bart Ehrman about some things, about his attitude toward the Greek New Testament and things. Did you know that non-biblical literature talks a lot about Jesus Christ? Instead of just using Bible, they're not going to accept the Bible. But how about history? How about if we go back and show other historical writings that mentions Jesus Christ personally? You see, you cannot just have a blind faith. Jesus was a true historical person. In fact, Art Herman wrote a book. You guys remember that? Just recently, not too long ago. The Historical Jesus. And yes, he does believe in historical Christ. He does believe in the divinity of Jesus. In fact, he told me, he said, oh, don't you realize the apostles made all that up about him being God? And of course, we couldn't get very far. He ended up hanging the phone up on me. But, put our conversation. We're in Panera Bread. We have a Bible study every Thursday morning at Panera Bread at 10:30. And I usually have a sign out. We were studying the book of Ecclesiastes. And we were studying about religions in general and looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. And one of our young ladies asked a question. She's a mother. She said, isn't it true, Rick, that somewhere in the Quran that the Islamists teach that if they're a faithful Islamic person, they die, that they'll have virgins waiting for them? I said, well, there's some that do teach that. And right away this guy started. He goes, can I interrupt just for a minute? He goes, I'm an Islamic. He said, I'd just like to answer that young lady. Not all Islamics believe that. Very few, he said, actually believe that. In fact, he said, I don't even believe you can have more than one wife. And we thanked him for participating. We let him join with us. Lauren said this, bless her heart. She goes, can I ask you a question? I said, sure. What do you think about Jesus? He said, well, we look at Jesus as a prophet, just like David's a prophet, Muhammad's a prophet. He said, we really do believe he was a great prophet, a good moral prophet. She said, can I ask you another question? Who's going to say no to Lord? I mean, she's just a sweetheart with these two little kids. He goes, sure. She said, why would you believe a man who lies? She said, no, he didn't claim to be just a prophet. He claimed to be the Son of God. And either he's the biggest liar that ever walked this earth, or he is exactly what he claimed. He just smiled and said nothing. Well, I was having a Memorial Day get-together for the whole church. I do barbecue on Memorial Day. Barbecue, whatever, everything like that. I said, why don't you come over to my house? And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And I'll tell you that he did. But, you know, he's been with us now for the last 4 weeks in our Bible study, or last 3 weeks in our Bible study. He's learning. All because of one. Now, my point is this. There's ways to approach people with the gospel. It doesn't always have to be just teaching from the Bible, but by your attitude and your life. We need to show people that the Bible is relevant. I deal with a lot of people when it comes to, I was a police chaplain for 23 years. I've dealt with a lot of people who are hooked on drugs and alcohol. We worked with a guy who was homosexual, became a child of God. And I tell you what, there's many people in this world, they're hurting. And even though we have a skeptical society, this is where we shine. This is where we can really teach others, because there's people out there hurting on a daily basis, and they're looking and needing Jesus in their life. When I see someone who's worrying, or somebody who's hurting, maybe emotionally, I said, the Bible can help you with that. Let me give you a true example. When you baptize this young family, husband and wife, I don't want to go into a lot of details, but make a long story short, he killed his 8-year-old daughter. He was driving drunk, and ends up with his 8-year-old daughter. He was hurt, and he knew one of our members. And one of the members came to me and said, could you call this guy? He's hurting. He's feeling so guilty. And he feels like it's all his fault, which it was a lot. I did. I called him up. I said, did you know the Bible has a lot to say about guilt? And the Bible can help you about how to deal with that guilt that you're feeling. And I said, you know what? He was really depressed. Him and his wife were very depressed because of just the whole scenario. I said, the Bible has a lot to say about depression. So let me sit down and show you how the Bible can help you emotionally. And we don't baptize them both. And they're faith and dedicated Christians right now. My point is this, that you have to show the Bible has the answers for life, and it can change your life for the better. I have a series I do, and I preached it in a couple meetings, called Life Skills for Relationships. I deal with anger management, how to overcome depression, how to deal with a poor self-image. These are things that people need. And when I hold Bible studies out in the public, at a civic center or something, this is what I teach. Because they need it. How many have a problem with anger? Am I the only one that has a problem with anger? And my whole point is, we're human, and the Bible has the answers that helps us on a daily basis. So again, you want to bring out a lot of times how the Bible can help you in the subjects. Share Christ and show how Christ has made you better. Man, I tell you what, I'm a guy that worries about everything. I'm not kidding you. I worried myself sick so many times, especially when I was back in school and had to write a thesis or write a paper. I worried all night long. I wouldn't eat or anything like that. I worried myself sick. And then the Bible helped me to overcome worry. And I shared that with other people. Did you notice the demonic guy who was, cured by Christ? He's now sitting in his right mind, and he's clothed. And listen to what Jesus said to him. Listen to this, I hope. There you go. Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you. Can I ask you a question? When's the last time you sat down with someone and said, this is what the Lord has done for me? The Lord has helped me with my problems. I used to have a bad temper, but God has helped me with that temper. Do you understand what I'm saying here? When you do that, you make the Bible come alive. It becomes relevant. It's not just a religious book. Hypocrisy is one of the worst things to try to convince a skeptic. You'll never do it if you're being a hypocrite. You cannot be a hypocrite. Sadly, some religious people are. When I was having my public debate with the Islamics, it was on a Thursday night and a Friday night, and I was sitting down and studying with this guy. We were both making our propositions together, and we're talking. He goes, can I ask you a question? He said, when I look at America, it claims to be a Christian nation, and you have these Christians, and he said, how can they believe in homosexuality and be a Christian? He said, I'll tell you, you won't find that as Islamic. We can't accept that lifestyle. How can they believe in abortion and they claim to be a Christian? Now, I try to explain to him, not all Christians are that way, right? But that was his mentality. They're hypocritical. Why should I sit and listen to a Christian who's a hypocrite? And that taught me a great lesson. There was a story told about this new preacher that came into town, and he was getting on the bus, and he paid his bus fare. As he paid it, the bus driver gave him a little bit too much change, 25 cents more. And he sat down in the back of the bus and started looking at it, and he said, "Oh, he overpaid me. Oh, it's just 25 cents. Who cares? Who's going to miss 25 cents? It's no big deal, all right?" And so he resigned himself to say, "I'm just going to let it go." But then he started walking out, and he said, he said, "Sir, you gave me 25 cents too much." And the bus driver says, "Yeah, I did that on purpose." He said, "I heard you're the new preacher in town, and I want to see if you're honest or not." And he said, "You know what?" He said, "I'm looking for a new church." He said, "I'll see you Sunday morning." And that preacher ended up baptizing him. Now, what if he would have just kept that 25 cents? I'm serious. You see, people are always watching. They're always looking at you. You cannot be a hypocrite. You have to live according to your principles if you're going to convict people about Christ. You guys know about Sam Harris. I'm sure you do. He's written several books. He's an atheist, well-known atheist. He wrote this called A Letter to a Christian Nation. You know why he wrote this little book? Because he saw the hypocrisy and the attitude of many so-called Christians. In fact, this is what he wrote in this book. The most hostile of these communications have come from Christians. This is ironic, as Christians generally imagine that no faith imparts the virtue of love and forgiveness more affectionately than their own. The truth is that many who claim to be transformed by Christ, by his love and deeply, even murderously intolerant of criticism. He said, Christians, they're some of the worst people I ever dealt with. And they really treat you bad. And so that's why he wrote that particular book. We have to be careful about our lifestyle. I'm not going to take time to read all these scriptures. You can turn and read them. But Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 through 16 talks about us being the salt and the light. What is the nature of salt and light? Well, they affect their environment, right? And we have to actually affect our environment that we live in. We have to actually make a difference somehow. And he said, I want you to do these things that you may glorify me. Again, Paul brings it so clear in a crooked, perverse generation. He says, shine as lights. Right now, we can shine as lights. You know, during the pandemic, we should have really been evangelizing people. Unfortunately, I call it a test from God. We failed miserably. But that was a time we could have really teach people about Jesus. We had a denominational church by us that didn't close the doors. They grew over 50% and still have been growing because they didn't close their doors. They said, hey, we believe our God is bigger than a virus. It was put on their sign. My God's bigger than a virus. Now, how come we didn't do that? How come we didn't think about that? We could have really reached the community, the religious community. Wow. They had no place to go, so people went to their congregation. It's a community church called the Amplified Church. I don't know why it's called that. I need to walk in someday and find out why it's called that. Never underestimate the power and the value of influence. Pathos. One of the main reasons some skeptics have a really hard time believing in God because the Bible talks about suffering. And this is the reasoning. The reason is God of the Bible is portrayed as God who is both all-powerful and good, all good. If that God exists, he would not have created a world filled with pain and suffering. Yet the world is filled with pain and suffering. Therefore, God doesn't exist. How would you answer somebody like that? You got an answer in your mind? Well, there's different types of suffering. There's suffering because we commit sin. We bring on suffering, right? We also know there are natural calamities. We have hurricanes, tornadoes, and people suffer. I had two of my best friends who are Christians were in a tornado. They both died, lost everything they had. Their children survived, but they didn't survive. I had another young couple that were killed in a car wreck. I baptized both of them several years ago. The point is, God said suffering's going to come about. You ever notice Luke chapter 13, 1 through 5, when it talks about the Galileans and how that the tower fell on them? And he he said, were they worse sinners? He goes, no, they weren't. Do you remember when he said Pilate mingled the blood of these Galileans, and he said, were they worse than others? No. Just happened. Sometimes things just happen. When you think about suffering, none of us are immune to suffering. Did you know Jesus suffered? I brought this out to an atheist one time. I said, you're worried about suffering? Jesus suffered. The Apostle Paul suffered. Many Christians suffered. And Jesus said, you know what? If you serve me, you're going to suffer. You're going to experience pain. So, suffering is part of life. In fact, let me get to that really, really quick. When it comes to suffering, whether there is a God or there is no God, you're going to suffer. There's death and pain in this world. And an atheist doesn't have a right to fuss about God and say he doesn't exist because of suffering, because whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, guess what? It's the survival of the fittest. Death is part of life. That's what an atheist believes. So, again, you can bring out other passages, but I like James chapter 1, verse 2 to 3. He said, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. How we react to these tragedies says a lot about our faith and about how we view life. When people can look at you and see that you can overcome tragedy, they can turn and say, oh, this young couple, by the way, that lost their daughter. Well, they found out that there's a lot of people in our congregation have suffered and lost loved ones. And they ask, how did you cope with it? You know. And we share how we cope with it because of our God, right? And so when it comes to the tragedy and difficulties, it's how you handle these things that are so important. My sister lost both her legs. She has 2 artificial legs. But the day that she was told that she probably won't walk until she gets her artificial legs, that she won't be able to do anything, oh, she said, no. She said, as soon as I'm able, I'm going to enter into a marathon, the wheelchair marathons. And she did. And in fact, she was coming up a hill, and a few of us were there to watch her. And this saw her, and he comes running out, and he's going to push her. She said, no, I don't want your help. If I can't make it up this hill by myself, I don't even need to be in this marathon. She explains how she makes up her bed. Things that she does as just everyday life is a chore. But you know what really motivates her? She said, with God, I can do all things. I can do all things in the Lord. You got to have faith, but you also have to make that faith come alive. Conclusion. How do we respond to a skeptic? 1 Peter 3:15 says, be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you the reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. First thing you need to do, pray. You pray. I love prayer. I'm a firm believer in prayer. I tell you, this is really cool. This really did happen just not long ago. 2 of our members who were teachers, they helped start the work we're with now, and they're great, great Christians. But they decided they're going to have to move to Florida and go take care of their elderly parents. And I don't blame them. I did the same thing. Why I went up to Downers Grove. So we just lost them. They called me up, said, we wanted to tell you before we tell anybody else, but Rick, we're putting our house up for sale and we're going to have to move. Oh, that broke my heart because he was our sound man. He was one of our technical guys. He was one of our teachers. She's the teacher of the gospel. Oh, man, they're going to be all over the place. I bowed my head and I said, God, can you please bring us a young couple that have kids? We need more kids. I'm not kidding. This really happened. Less than a minute, I get a phone call from a guy named Jeff Bachmiller. You know who I'm talking about. And he calls me on the phone. He's out in the soccer field. He goes, hey, look, I was just offered a job. I'm going to go and look at the job, and we're going to maybe move in your area. And we saw you guys out on the web, and we would like to come and maybe just talk to you a little bit. I said, no problem, man. You got a place to stay? You stay with us. We don't care. My wife and I have 2 extra bedrooms. He's okay. He hung up the phone. And I said, God, thank you so much. That's pretty quick. You know, I believe in small talk with God. I'll explain that some other time privately. But what we find is that they end up moving in Bibles. And he had to stay with us until his wife and kids came. And they turned out to be a very strong, and Dan King knows, baptized his mom and dad. Now, that's the power of God. That's the power of prayer. We have to really believe in prayer. I cringe when I hear people say, well, does prayer really work? Yes, it works. There's a lot of power there. I pray for people before I go into a Bible study. God, open up their hearts. Give me the wisdom I need and the knowledge I need. Sympathize with their losses. You mourn those who mourn. I had a middle-aged lady. I went to go see her. She used to be a member of the church when I was in Indiana. And I knocked on the door and I said, hey, my name is Rick Billingsley. She said, you know what? I don't believe in God anymore. God has let me down. I said, why? He took my little daughter. Now, what do you do with that situation? I said, well, I'm really sorry. When did this happen? How did it happen? Can you show me some pictures of it? I said, you know, I've suffered some loss too. My father, at that point, my father just died of a massive heart attack at work. But I said, you know, you have to understand, it's not God's fault. Things just happen. And I took to those scriptures that we talked about. And so I said, tell you what, I said, if you're grieving, I can help you with that. Because I got a wonderful book that's been written to help you grieve. The Bible. And we studied and she came back. Had another situation too. When I was in Indiana, I went through the old directory and I saw that certain people, I saw names there that weren't attending anymore. And one would live right around the corner of the church building. I went and knocked on the door. She's a young lady. Her name was Shelley. I said, my name is Rick Billingsley. I'm the new minister over here at the church, in the Church of Christ. She says, I don't have time right now. I got to go to the hospital. My son has a rare yeast infection, and I have to get up to the hospital. I said, you lead, I'll follow. And I went up to the hospital. And then I called my wife, and I called a couple of ladies. I said, you guys need to get up here. I said, we got a young lady who's got a very serious situation about her child. And they did. She came back to services. And in turn, we got Linda, her sister, who was a great teacher. And she came back. That's taking interest in people. That's sympathizing with them. Very important that we do that. Show them that you care. Learn to listen. I don't talk when I'm with somebody. Usually when I'm going to study, I ask a lot of questions and I just sit and listen. Listen all I can and get to know them personally. Show hospitality. That is very, very important, that you have to show hospitality. In fact, I'm a firm believer that hospitality is another form of teaching God's word. Ever notice how many times, let's go back really quick on that if I can. Do you ever notice how many times the word hospitality is used in the Bible? It's used in 1 Timothy, Romans, Acts, Hebrews, Peter, and 3 John. But let me tell you, even without the word occurrence, it's there when Zacchaeus, I just preached on Zacchaeus this last week. When Zacchaeus welcomed Jesus to his home. How about when the Levi invited Jesus to his house and invited some friends? How about when Mary or Martha invited the Lord to her home? How about when Lydia invited Paul and his entourage? How about the jailer when he invited Paul and Silas? You know what's really funny here? Look at every one of those incidents. Guess what? There are non-believers inviting believers. Isn't that impressive? I invited that Muslim guy to come out. His name is Kean, by the way. I'll call him like Kean. You know what? That guy couldn't get over it. What we did, we had a hayride, we invited volleyball. I made pork. He wouldn't eat the beef, but he brought chicken legs, some of the best sticks I think I ever had. And he stayed longer than most people. And now, because of that, he's been coming to our study. Hospitality is a great means of teaching God's word. And we have to actually take time to invite them out and teach them. Let me tell you what hospitality does. It's a big deal. It shows that the gospel is authentic, it's real, it's believable, it's attractive, and livable. Hospitality builds relationships. Share the scriptures with people. Just share what the Bible has to say. In 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9 through 11, I think it's so important for us to realize that the early church was made up of murderers, liars, adulterers, and fornicators. This guy came back from Vietnam. I met him, and my brother served 2 tours of Vietnam. And he came back, and he said, he was a spouse of one of the ladies in church. And I said, I'd like to study with you. He goes, he said, preacher, you don't know some awful things I did in Vietnam. He said, I couldn't even live a Christian life because he said, I was just deserted. Wow, I never heard anybody say that in my life. I said, because of that attitude, you deserve it, brother. You deserve it. I said, are you worse than a murderer, a liar, adulterer? Do you realize the early church was made up of homosexuals? He goes, no. I took him to the passage. He goes, well, if they can become a Christian, so can I. Right on. You see, share the scriptures with people. It's not hard to do. Just show what the Bible teaches. It's God's saving power. Colossians chapter 3, I always, when I get ready to baptize somebody, I want to become a Christian, I say, well, before we do anything, let's go over to Colossians chapter 3. I want you to look at verses 1 through 10. And the very first couple of verses talk about being risen with Christ. That's through baptism. They know that. And I said, but notice who he's talking to here. He's talking to Christians. Man, you're not going to be baptized and walk out of that water grave of baptism and say, oh, I never liked it. I know you. I quit swearing. No. Christianity is a lifetime commitment. It's a work in progress. You are a work in progress every single day of your life. That's why we rely upon the mercy of God. This young couple, they kept apologizing. They said, you're going to accept us in with all our baggage? That's what he kept telling me. I said, man, I got baggage. Everybody in that church building has baggage. We will accept you with open arms and let you know how encouraging you are to us. They said, we've been a couple of churches, but we never had anybody to accept us that way. Brother, there's a lot of practical ways we can work others with us and teach this stuff. Okay, I'm done. Get me emotional now. Do I have to answer questions now, Kyle? Oh, I do? Okay. Thanks, Kyle. All right, I'm open for questions. Anybody have a question or comments? Sure. Kyle? You?
Yes, sir. I liked your point about ethos. Paul in 2 Corinthians describes that we don't preach ourselves, but Christ crucified. How do you attain that balance between not preaching yourself, but allowing your life
I gave her a card. I told her to sit down and talk to you. I said, I love you. You're so happy to see people. So, visit you. And she did. And we baptized both of them. I took interest in her. Another one was Donna. This is down in Middleburg. Donna Stover. Get a load of this. Stover was the fastest cashier at. Now, being in the South, there are not a lot of people. Fast. I said, Donna. I said, would you come sometime? She go, well, I go to the Simeon Baptist Church. My husband and I both go there, and my kids. I said, just come visit sometime. I stood up before the whole congregation. I said, listen. I said, when you go, see, cards with us and invite. Later, I'm going through Donna's line, and I said, Donna, are you going to? I want to show you something. She pulled out, I'm not exaggerating, handfuls of cards. She said, we're coming. Her sister-in-law. And parents. Her kids have been converted. What if I never approached Donna in the grocery store? Can you see taking interest in people make a huge difference? So to answer your question, I just take interest in people. That's all I do. I'm going to get kicked, right? Oh.
I've lived on the street where I live for 25 years. I was the first house there. There are now, I think, 6. And I've invited people to meetings and mentioned private studies and never got a taker. My next door neighbor moved, so I prayed for the Lord to send someone that might be interested in studying the Bible. A Muslim family moved in the house. So I thought, okay, I prayed for it. I'm going to go try to talk to them. The guy is deeply, deeply committed Muslim. He teaches in one of their mosques in Louisville. Where I'm leading up here is just thinking of what's the most effective things you can do, what does he need to hear. The one thing I have honed in on, he's great. I've had 2 studies with him. I keep trying to work in things about the death of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ, because I feel like that's something missing in their religion, in the Quran. And he's still open with me. He hasn't agreed to another study yet. But are there other things that you think are especially significant to talking to a Muslim?
You know, I pray that Kian obeys the gospel. I think we're really close. He's been coming, and I pray that we'll be able to, his heart will be open to the gospel. But, you know, I would stay with the Quran and say, could you show me just from the Quran about Jesus? Believe it or not, they believe that he was born of a virgin. And so as he would continue to talk about, that's what we did. Quran teaches about Jesus Christ. I think by Lauren asking that question, it just threw him for a loop because he wasn't prepared to answer that question. And he said to us at the get-together, he said, I'm still not prepared to answer that question, you know. But I don't have all the answers, but I would say let them sit down and show you from the Quran what they believe when it comes to about Jesus Christ, and then you can bring out about the nature of Christ and about being deity, you know. said that to me as well, you know. But we know better. And the fact of the matter is, Christ made it clear on his own, not just the apostles. That I went through the I ams with him. It did work. He saw that. He goes, wow, I never knew that Christ actually said he was the Son of God. He always thought he was just a prophet as well. But you go through the I ams, and you look at what I am. I went through every I am in the New Testament. And it's very clear. He made it very clear that he was God. Very God.
Rick and I have known one another for a very long time, and yeah, and we worked together a lot down through the years. And one of the things I love about Rick does not emphasize the negatives. He has a tendency to go on and forget the negatives. I remember one time he and I spent a full week together trying to get a conservative work established, and it just flopped. We just, at the end, I'm not saying that our efforts were wasted, but it came to naught. And then another time we had a long study Rick and I did when he's still in the Cary area, but with that congregation we had a long study with this couple.
She obeyed the gospel, by the way.
She did.
She did.
Well, I guess her husband called us everything except good things. He called us about every ugly name you could think of. And
she said, I apologize. I was so mean to you guys.
And
she was mean to us.
But the thing about Rick is Rick does not dwell upon those negative things. You'll notice how he talks about his successes. There are lots of failures, lots and lots of failures. But he doesn't think about those, and that would be something every one of us would do well to learn that lesson.
No, I brag on him all the time. Go ahead.
In Ron's question, I was just going to add that, you know, the Quran will claim that Jesus is the Messiah. The Quran will also claim that Scripture is from God. So you can't say, well, it's corrupted, and yet you rely upon the Quran if the Quran claims it's from God.
Well, the people of the Scripture, that's what he's talking about, the people who believe in the Bible. I had so I'll tell you what happened. On Wednesday night, I was teaching about Islam. And about 4 Islam came in when they saw the sign. I was teaching Islam. I did it for about 3 weeks. And they came in and they were surprised that I had their Quran. In fact, they came and said, how did you get your hands on that Quran thing? I said, well, I took some classes in Western Kentucky with a guy who was very fluent with, Arabic and all that stuff. And anyway, he was a great teacher. And so I told him how I got it, and we began to talk. He said, could we get up next week on a Wednesday night and just give what we think about, talk a little bit about? I said, well, let me talk to the elders. And we decided, well, let's have a Thursday night and a Friday night. And so the Thursday night was going to be in our building, which we did. And then Friday night was at the mosque. And we had a great, great time. We worked together. We went about, our position, stuff like that. But
It's very similar to Mormonism because it claims to be built on something it then has to try to discredit.
one Buddhist. It was just, and I wanted to try to approach it such a way that she wouldn't turn off. And so, every Everything's got about. So what I came up with this idea called the total person, and I only use it for people like Hindus. People who have no knowledge about God or the Bible. And I sat down and this couple, they brought their teenage daughters. They were from India. They were Hindu. They visited Grove, and then one thing led another. Began to. So I went through the total person. I showed your physical body controlled by your emotions. Your emotion controls the mind of man is the spirit within us. If we can get our spirit, and then we'll act. Studying with an atheist, put together, just talking about how man works, his relationship to God. It's a very simple thing.
Brother Rick, you obviously have a love of people and a love of truth, and that comes out. It just shows forth in all ways. But among our fellowship, there are some that seem to be losing faith into the distinctiveness of the gospel. You ended this discussion by saying the Word of God is God's saving power. And they would rely rather on friendship evangelism and sort of never really unsheath the sword of the Spirit. What do you have to say about that tendency, or how do we avoid that tendency of just relying on warmth and personal affection and not dealing with the nitty-gritty of divine truth?
I was at Middleburg time, and we took our kids out, and a bunch of us got together, and we went miniature golfing inside this place. And I had 3 little kids. Kelly was about 5, I think. Steve was 4, and Michael, I think, was like 2. And I said, I want you to get up. What? I've never seen it before. It was just almost an hour. Happens when you discipline children at an early age. She goes, wow. I said, sit down and study. Well, without them, you can't do it. Just like with anger, absolutely. So he said in my class,
experience of such a level of hostility that comes from Christians sometimes. That, and I can tell you, somebody who tries to maintain some social media presence, I'm frankly embarrassed more sometimes by responses from my fellow Christians, including some preachers, who just don't seem to have a level of being able to speak to somebody else without outright contempt. So I wonder if you can talk to or speak to that kind of an attitude, especially among Christians, as we try to reach out to people who do not share not only our specific beliefs but even fundamental things. If we can't be civil with them, we don't have a conversation.
Between an argument and a discussion. Either one or both of you have quit listening. That's the problem. And when I see somebody has quit listening, let me give you a true example. This happened to me. I was studying with Tracy and Doug, and she grew up in Baptist church with Mr. Ferguson around the corner. And we were in the third lesson about the Lord's Supper. She said, "Rick, would you go with me? Would you go with me and talk to my preacher about this passage?" I said, "Sure." Now, he didn't know what it was, and she probably got in trouble with Paul, I'm sure. But she took me saying to the office. Me. He said, "Now, I want you to sit here and be quiet." That's kind of never met him. I'm not kidding you. He said, "You sit there and you just be quiet. Don't say anything." So Tracy went to Acts 20, verse 7. And I just happened to kind of look around, and I was looking at his desk, and it said, "What we believe." So I took it off his desk, and lo and behold, they were quoting Acts 20, verse 7 for Lord's Supper. And so Tracy says, "How come we don't take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week?" And he goes, "Tracy, that's not the Lord's Supper." I just took it and slid that over to Tracy. I never said anything. She grabbed me and goes, "I told you to shut up!" Like that. I never raised my voice. In fact, as he got louder, I started whispering. He goes, "What are you whispering about?" I said, "Well, that's the Bible. The Bible says upon the first day of the week." You know what? When we walked down that guy's office, not turning me, she said, "I didn't do that." In fact, she told him, this is very funny. She said, "Would you have treated my brother the way you treated Mr. Rick?" And all of a sudden, this guy grabs my hand, he starts crying. He goes, "I'm sorry, brother. I didn't mean to be ugly. I didn't mean to be mean." The 1 minute he's screaming at me, another minute he's crying. He said, "I'm sorry." I thought, wow, he's pretty good at it. But, you know, that turned her on. She obeyed the gospel. Doug obeyed the gospel. They're still real faithful, dedicated today down in the third floor. You know, when people act that way, it comes through that they're not sincere. So never, ever argue with people. Never raise your voice. One time when I was younger, I used to argue. I done a lot of it wrong. Dan's right. I have more bad than successes. More worse things I've done. But this preacher and I got into a discussion one time, and he raised his voice, and I raised mine, and then I raised my voice again, and he raised his, and I said, "Well, quit arguing with me, because well, you started the whole thing, you know." And he was correct. I shouldn't have done it. I should have just been really calm, lower my voice, you know, and try to get them to pay attention. That happened. Bob Childers, I don't know if you remember Bob Childers or not, up in Joliet. Bob took me into a Bible study with this lady, his neighbor, and she invited her preacher, who let me know right away. Now, I was a young kid, and he let me know, I'm a theologian. Oh, okay. I like that. He's a theologian. And so we started going through the first lesson of the 4 lessons that I used to teach people, and he goes, "I know where you're going. I know exactly where you're going." And he took my paper and tore it up, right in my face. Now, Bob's sitting on this side, you know, and he just threw it right in my face, and he started screaming at me, and I started whispering. down. Why are you whispering about me? I said, I'm talking about you. Well, you know, that was the greatest thing that guy ever did. He helped me so much. She became a Christian. She couldn't believe her preacher. In fact, he was waiting for us to leave. I wasn't going anywhere. He said, aren't you going to go home and eat lunch? I said, no, not really. I said, I just like to stay here. And we talked. She was so apologetic by the way he behaved himself. So I love these guys when they get mad. I love when they get upset. Maybe I can agitate them a little bit more. When we walked out of the house, Bob turns to me, Bob Childers goes, Rick, I got to ask you a question. What would you have done if he would have punched you in the face? I said, probably punch him back. I don't. But, so my answer to that is just stay calm. That's what the Bible says. Don't argue. There's no sense in arguing. You're never going to get anywhere. You just got to be a better person. Stay calm. That's really good advice. To me later on when I talked to him, themselves. Great, you know. And so, again, you know, just looking at the people, taking interest in people, but, you know, the Bible says, what good is it for me to stand up there and quote scripture after scripture, and they have no clue what I'm doing or quoting scripture. So I'd rather get into a Bible study. I always ask people, can I have a Bible study? Then we'll get into the businesses and stuff.
I got one for you if I can throw in. Along those lines, you talked about your congregation. What are some maybe tools or resources or ways to get the congregation involved in setting up those Bible studies or creating that kind of an atmosphere where people are welcomed and interested?
Human nature. Nobody will volunteer. I don't ask for volunteers. I call people up and say, look, I got Bible study Tuesday night. I need somebody to sit in. I need you to go with me. That's it. They're not going to stand and say no. They'll say, okay. I didn't have to be Hartsville. Remember Ben Russell, Hartsville, and also I didn't know he wasn't a Christian. I really didn't know that. He's been coming with his wife every single service. And so we invited him over for dinner. We had several families over. And I turned to Richard and said, Richard, I just set up a Bible study Tuesday night with a young couple. I need you to sit in that Bible study with me. He said, well, all right. But he said, you know, I'm not a Christian. I said, why? He goes, I'm not a Christian. I said, well, why aren't you? I said, you're more faithful to some of our members, man. Why aren't you a Christian? He goes, well, nobody ever asked. I said, would you want to be baptized? He said, sure. And we baptized on that Sunday afternoon. He, in turn, he had an Amway group of people. And he got the Greens and the Strange, the family called Strange, he got them also involved in sitting in Bible studies and baptizing all of them as well. Middleburg was a beautiful place, wasn't it? It's just an easy place. We grew from 70 to 240 people within about 8 years. That had 197 baptisms. I could literally go out every day, and I could set up Bible studies at Middleburg. It was that ripe. Just that ripe. You gonna ever go?
To Steve's question, I wonder if Jonah 4 may be a little bit of a lesson to us. There, the Lord rebukes Jonah for the contempt and the attitude he had towards Nineveh, but he had pity towards a plant. And maybe the attitude we need to have is pity, even when it frustrates us, to realize that these are people that need the gospel. These are people that are lost.
I can give you a couple good stories. Another one, really quick. When we baptized John was a homosexual. I won't tell you his last name, but he was a homosexual, and he was a young man dying of AIDS. And I was doing I was a police chaplain, but I also did hospital as a chaplain at Humana Hospital. I volunteered my services. It was on a Saturday night, and what happened, the chief of staff came to me and said, "Rick, would you go and sit with this young man in his room? He's dying. He won't live through the night." We called his mom in, and so I said, "Sure, I'll do that." Well, he couldn't talk, but he could write, and we started corresponding. I introduced who I was. He introduced himself. And I just asked a simple question. I said, "Do you think you were born a homosexual, or do you think you acquired a desire, or you desired it?" He wrote down, "I desired it." Well, what did that tell me right off the bat? I'm dealing with an honest man. So I proceeded to teaching him the truth and what the Bible. I started out showing him 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9 through 11, and Romans chapter 1. And I pointed out that lifestyle God does not accept. And then he wanted to be baptized. Well, that night, chief of staff wouldn't let us. I am not going to elders was a contractor. He built the chief of staff's house. I called up Steve. I don't know what happened last night and this morning, but he wanted to baptize. So Steve and I and a couple other guys, we rushed to the hospital. We stopped and bought some visqueen, plastic, and some plywood. Built a homemade baptistry in John's room and baptized John. And last time I heard, he's still alive, doing great. He didn't. We were concerned. John, you have to do it. You have to show these people you care. And if you don't, what good is it? We had, can I tell one more story or I got to quit? Okay. Miller. You know Gwen Miller? Remember her at Middleburg? She was a young mom. She had a bubbly attitude. She is such a sweetheart. She's a Southerner, right to the core, the way she talks. She's really cute. I'm talking about it in her heart. And so anyway, she was sitting at the park watching her kids play, and this young approached her and propositioned her. And now, most women might get angry, might get upset, or something like that. Oh, I'm being recorded, aren't I? She might kill me for this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway because she's so cool. She didn't get upset. She said, well, would you like to study with me about what the Bible teaches concerning being a lesbian or being a homosexual? And we did. And she obeyed the gospel. And she became a wife of a gospel preacher. But let me tell you what really convicted her. She made a comment. She goes, you know, if I become a Christian, I can't live by myself. I cannot afford my apartment. Her old partner and her were splitting the cost. And one of our deacons said, you don't worry about that. We got to help them get out of it. If you don't, you're wasting your time. I'm sorry. Too much.
Any other questions? Ron?
I just thought of a quick follow-up point on Lance's question, and you may can add something. But I've learned through the years, not everybody has the set of talents that Rick has. And in a congregation, we don't want to make people feel like they're unfaithful Christians because they don't have that set of talents. So part of what I think we have to do is in our teaching, and as Rick said, some of it can involve taking people with us when we teach, but convincing people, do what you can do. I think of widows that we have that would not be effective to go out and teach somebody. But their faithfulness and their inviting others and using, as Rick explained very effectively, 1 Peter 3, their example does create these opportunities. So convincing people, do what you can do.
Well, you have to train
what
people.
We call a personal worker in that formal sense, but you can do something.
I train people to do what I do. If you can't duplicate yourself, again, you're not going to be effective. You have to be able to duplicate yourself. When I was at Middleburg, we had 62% of that congregation involved in personal Bible studies, where I was not personally involved. Downers Grove, we had several men that were involved in Bible studies. I didn't have to be in a Bible study. Where I'm at now, we have an older gentleman, and he's been in several Bible studies. He's setting up one right now with another person. And he goes, I don't need you. I said, you're right. You're right. You don't need me. But I'll never forget when the preacher that followed me down at Middleburg, he stood up before the congregation after a year, and he said, look, I know there's Bible studies going on. He said, I want to become part of it. And nobody asked him to sit in. And he was really troubled with that. So he calls me on the phone. He said, Rick, none of these guys are going to invite me to these Bible studies. I said, man, they don't need you. They have been trained to do what they do. We had training classes. We do still have training classes for them. And how to teach. It's a whole personal work program that we teach on how to see lost. You have to train people to do what you do, or you will never do it. It's got to be simple. Keep it simple. Can't make it complex. I saw some of these materials that people use to teach the lost, and they're so long and so complex. It's a wonder they can even convert anybody with it because of the complexity. People can't do it. Let me tell you about Ron Halbrook and Dan. We went to the Philippines. You remember that one of the boys at Elmore, I pushed him through a cross? to the mountains where the headhunters. Remember that? I pushed him over the bus, and he comes flying out. I said, "What are you flying out for?" I was trying to get him to pass out, some stuff. He goes, "Mr. Rick, they're going to the mountains." Well, big deal. I don't care about mountains. Well, I guess they're headhunters. So they're in the mountains. He comes back and tells all the boys, "Mr. Rick tried to get me killed." Thanks, God. I appreciate it.